alaikum and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome you all to this panel, the third session and the second panel of this important conference on militias and armies and the development in the combat and political performance of armed non-state and state actors. First of all, I'd like to thank my dear friend Omar Ashur and his friends for organizing this event at a time when non-state actors have been generating a lot of interest, more than maybe the last 90 years when all the talk focus on what states can do and cannot do. We discovered in the last 30 years or so that non-state actors are no less effective when it comes to destabilizing countries. So in this session we will be discussing states, militias, combat capabilities for Status-Quos. Our three panelists will be Mus'ab Al-Aloosy, Rudolf, and Abdou Moussa. Mus'ab Al-Aloosy is an assistant professor here. He was a researcher with the Peace Institution in the United States, and he studied at Fletcher University. He is interested in the Middle East in general, but his talk will focus on the deterrence by insurgents, Hezbollah's deterrent policy and capability against Israel. The concept of deterrence has been around for a long time, and what it means is any party, like we call it, first party wants to attack the second party, or the second party, that the second party can be able to respond by inflicting enough harm to outweigh the benefits gained by the first party. So the second party should therefore establish clear red lines for the first party to know. Also, the second party should have the capabilities militarily to make good any threats they make. There is a unique situation we're dealing with now, and that is the deterrence by a non-state actor, which is the Hezbollah, against Israel. This has many reasons. The main reason is the weakness of the Lebanese state. The state of Lebanon gained its independence 2 years before its establishment of Israel, and the Lebanese state could not deter any attacks, and the clearest example of that is the Hula massacre, when the Israeli forces invaded a village and slaughtered tens of villages. The state of Lebanon could not deter Israel. The state of Lebanon's weakness is being compounded over decades of lack of capability to monopolize the armed forces and the use of arms and violence, especially when it comes to armed groups in the south of Lebanon. You know, in 1975 the state in Lebanon collapsed, and that gave Israel the opportunity to invade Lebanon until the Litani River, and until 1981, when the Israeli forces reached Beirut. Of course, throughout these events, the state of Lebanon was unable to resist Israeli expansion. After that came the armed groups who started to resist Israel. They were born to different ideologies. One of these is Hezbollah, and according to one source I spoke to inside the Hezbollah, said they started with different cells. They had problems in communication, problems in getting the equipment and munitions. The nature of their operations when they first started was suicide missions. But when the General Secretary was assassinated, who was Abbas al-Musawi, things have changed. They started bombarding northern parts of Israel using Katyusha rockets, and this was the first time the Hezbollah used such rockets against Israel. The second thing that happened, Hezbollah is at least accused of, if not the actual perpetrators of the bombing in Argentina, which led to the killing of many Jewish citizens in Argentina until 2000, when the Israeli forces withdrew from South Lebanon. From that day onwards, the leadership of the Hezbollah decided that there will be another confrontation with Israel. So they spent 6 years preparing for any such eventuality. In fact, in 2006, this happened, and Israel could not achieve or fulfill the political objectives behind that war. After 2006, it became apparent that Israel cannot defeat Hezbollah to the extent of obliterating it, and Hezbollah's deterrence capability have been established, and it is said that Hezbollah has in its possession 150,000 rockets, which is a part of the strategic deterrence against Israel. The main problem for Israel is not the accuracy of these rockets, but the large number of these, multiplicity, because Israeli defenses cannot intercept all these weapons if they fired at it in one day. This became apparent in 2009 when Hamas and another group from the Gaza Strip fired more than 1,000 projectiles and rockets. The Israeli defenses managed to intercept 240 only. So therefore, if there is any confrontation between Hezbollah and Israel, and during which Hezbollah fired 1,500 rockets against Israel, and only 30% of them were intercepted, because although some studies indicate that Israel's capability to intercept them is less than 30%, but let's suppose that they do shoot down 30%, then this means 1,000 rockets landing on Israel on daily basis for 6 months. The impact of this will be huge on Israeli society. For this reason, the Hezbollah has changed its thinking and focused on having this missile capability to create an impact on the Israeli military and civilians. Also, in addition, there is Arrow 3 or other Israeli systems, or the Iron Dome, are very costly. I think each rocket costs $40,000 to $50,000, which is fired against very cheaply manufactured and produced Hezbollah missiles. There is another problem for the Israeli defenses. because the number of rockets coming from the Hezbollah is expected to be very large indeed. There will be a time gap in changing the munitions for the rockets fired from the missile shield, and therefore this will have an impact on the ability of the Israelis to intercept them. Also, according to some statements attributed to Hassan Nasrallah, maybe the Daimuna reactor or some factories near Jaffa which contain chemical materials can be attacked. And also there is the other factor of that attacks taking part outside the region. For example, as we said, the Hezbollah was accused of the Argentine attack. Also, there was attacks in Azerbaijan, Turkey, Thailand, and other countries. This can also be part of the deterrence capabilities of the Hezbollah if attacked by the Israel. There is another factor which is to target Israeli launching pads on the coast or on Israeli ships. In 2006, Hezbollah attacked the Israeli ships, and the Yochonot system was mentioned at that time. This is a very important development so far as the combat capability of non-state actors, and we're talking about the Hezbollah now being able to deter such an important power like Israel, whereas the Lebanese state could not do that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Musab. Thank you for meeting the time allocated. You talked about 3 points. When we talked about Hezbollah, we have to remember that the Lebanese state was not successful to move from a sectarian state into a nation state. I think, have they done so, they would have been able to have a military establishment to limit the power of Hezbollah, but they remained a sectarian state. When we talk about Israel, this reminds us about something very important, and the first lecture that reminded us of the war transformations. Israel, when it was established, most organizations were non-state actors, and they were able to impose their hegemony on Britain itself. This reminds us or leads us to thinking about the establishment of the Hebrew state in Israel and how these armed organizations, how they were able to develop themselves for them to become a state. So Dr. Musab, thank you so much. An excellent intervention. I would like to move to the second intervention by Lena Rudolf, who is from King's College London. She has got a master's in political science and Islamic studies from Heidelberg, and she specialized in political science. She graduated in 2012, and also she worked in the Institute of Heidelberg when it comes to international conflicts, and she moved between Libya, Yemen, Tunisia, and Egypt. So she's going to talk about the combat capabilities of the popular mobilization units.
I will try to follow the example and keep it in 15 minutes. So just a short introduction to my research. I have been looking in particular at the relationship between the Hashd al-Sha'bi and the Iraqi state. Now, this relationship has been so far based on the notion of a win-win equilibrium. But since the latest events that have happened in Iraq, this equilibrium is being constantly renegotiated. So as announced by Professor, I will elaborate later on the command and control structure and also on the combat capabilities. But with those combat capabilities fluctuating in different organizational stages of the Hashd al-Sha'bi and also among the different brigades, I hope foremost that my presentation will sensitize you for the more strategic question. And this, in my perspective, is not only how the actual combat capabilities, but how the projection of virtual capabilities and their framing within a national narrative have helped the Hashid in their quest for legitimacy and also in their attempt to contest the state into speaking Bordesian terms in the field of security provision in Iraq. So I would like to start with a short outline of the Pmu case and also a bit about like the context of their emergence. Regardless whether we like it or not, currently the Pmu has come to constitute a state-sanctioned paramilitary umbrella. It comprises approximately 160,000 fighters, around 24,000 or 25,000 of them are still not registered with the Pmu Commission, and it has currently a budget of 2.16 billion US dollars. Currently it's organized around 60 brigades whose capabilities vary from a brigade to brigade, and they compete with each other over spoils, over turfs, often have competing and conflicting ideological convictions. And for today's sessions, I would love to try like to present an idea of how we can specify like the different dimensions and like how they play out on Iraqi territory. So how did the whole adventure start? That after being subjected like to a systemic politicization, the Iraqi army collapsed in the face of the self-proclaimed Islamic State and also like in the face of its red-tag militias, even like with improvised equipment. And the security vacuum that emerged provided a window of opportunity. Meetings of the Shia-led National Alliance that have preceded the fall of Mosul indicate that the plans for the creation of so-called defense mujahideen units under Maliki were already in the making. So the fatwa by Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani ended up bestowing legitimacy on an already existing scheme for security sector hybridization. The fatwa had indeed refrained from adopting any Shiite or like sect-coded specific references, and it had addressed all of like able-bodied Iraqi citizens to enlist within Iraqi security forces. But due to the polarized state and the disintegration of the formal national defense infrastructure, pre-existing factions, some of which belonged to US designated special groups, were commissioned or sort of authorized by Maliki's administration to take on responsibility for the management and organization of the overflow of volunteers responding to Sistani's fatwa. So like some of those formations have already accumulated experience in asymmetric warfare during like the resistance against US and coalition forces following the US invasions, and some like Badr already had like pre-existing combat experience of resisting the Ba'ath regime of Saddam Hussein. These factions played a very interesting card because of this experience in logistics and because of their ties to commissioned Iranian security advisors. They formed or like coined the narrative that it's their national responsibility to reactivate their units, like which have more or less been functioning in the underground or like in the unregulated spaces of the state, and to intervene to help consolidate the experience like which ended up as the Hashd al-Shabi. Following that, there have been several attempts by members of the Iraqi administration to formalize the status of this paramilitary umbrella. Already like with Order 91, Abadi, the Executive Order 91, created a sort of ambivalence. So on the one hand, it wanted to organize them following the model of the counterterrorism services, right? But on the other hand, it still defined them as an independent. Now, like this ambivalence was later on inherited by the so-called Hashd law passed by the Iraqi parliament in November 2016, in which they were defined as independent but also part of the security forces and responding directly to the commander-in-chief, to the prime minister's office. This circumstance allowed them, on the one hand, to keep a foot within the state infrastructure and to claim state-sanctioned legitimacy, while still preserving resistance operations and illicit economic activities in the underground, often also under the weary eye of Iraqi administration by that time. What this independence entails is still not defined, or in most of the cases is being determined by some of the already like embedded factions leaders who still dominate key directorates within the, I would say, cosmetically restructured Popular Mobilization Commission. The most important piece of legislation was released by Abdul Mahdi. It was Order 313, and it presented a new structure meant to reorganize the responsibilities, but also the decision-making power within the commission. Some analysts in the beginning, in the initial hours of the release, demonstrated, I would say, rather wishful interpretations, claiming that this structure would necessarily limit the decision-making power of the back then serving as deputy chairman of the Pmu Commission, the late Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes. But based on my interviews with Pmu commanders, but also with members of Iraqi security forces, this was not really the case. Under the new structure, the post of a deputy chairman of the commission was abolished, and a new post was introduced, and that was the chief of staff. So the chief of staff was to take responsibility over the 5 very important resorts within the commission. First, intelligence and information. Second, supplies and procurement. Administration and personnel, the whole HR portfolio. Fighters affairs, and operations. The operations are meant to be restructured under 8 operation commands, and those are to include 23 brigades. Now, this implies knowing that currently we still have around 60 Pmu Commission sanctioned brigades that also carry brigade numbers. This implies that there would be a period of consolidation or an attempt at right-sizing like these brigades and trying at least like to equalize their combat capabilities. Following the assassinations of Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes and Qasem Soleimani, we witnessed a very lively debate over the succession. This concluded with members, higher-ranking members from the PMU leadership uniting around the profile of Abu Fadak, who is one of the major veterans of the Islamic resistance. Most of the media releases referred to him as former Secretary General of Kataib Hezbollah, but like the more interesting part is that he was already involved with Mujahideen and Badr circles in Iran and had a very similar profile to that of Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes. And one of the interesting narratives, because I'm very much interested in the political discourse, they referred to him in Arabic. They said if Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes was the Mohandes, the engineer of the Hashd or the architect of the Hashd, then Abu Fadak will be Mohandes al-Intiqam. He would be like the engineer of the revenge. So like this still implies that retribution will be coming. We don't know in which form, we don't know when, we don't know how it will be commissioned, but I seriously doubt that even like with the will of let's say, high-ranking Iranian officials to sort of like contain this appetite for resistance or for revenge, I am not sure that they currently have the leverage over like this array of, let's say, wannabe Hezbollah units within the PMU Commission, but also like with their presence outside of the PMU Commission. It also remains to be seen to which extent he would have the military charisma and the credibility, but also like the visionary perspective of Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis to equalize these combat capabilities between the different brigades without like necessarily alienating the more disadvantaged units or the so-called like underdogs who have never had like this level of leverage or access like to the deep-seated leadership within the PMU Commission. For that purpose, it's important like to indicate that the fate of these 24,000 fighters that are still not registered but serving within the Hashad has still not been decided. There is a resistance within the Iraqi administration to increase the budget because it's simply like not sustainable with an already overblown public sector in Iraq. So this remains like one of the more contentious points for a security sector reform. Now to come back like to the way like those different brigades are managed. Now we have brigades that largely resemble the structures of local defense units. So they have been allocated to specific areas of operation. For example, the Furqat al-Abbas al-Qitaliya is mainly responsible for guarding the border between Anbar and Karbala. The same refers also to local Sunni Hashid units like Liwas al-Hadin, Fursan Jabur, or Liwa Tufuf, which was very recently portrayed more in depth by Ayman al-Tamimi in an interview in his blog, mainly active in Anbar province. There is a second type which have been rather extracted from their local base of recruitment. If we look, for example, at the presence or like the monopoly that Saraya Salam units have in Samarra, and there have been also sometimes conflicting reports on how well they have managed the interaction also with local residents. From my personal interviews, I have learned that at least like the pressure exerted onto them to keep a neater profile in terms of human rights violations, but also in terms of involvement in economic activities has contributed somehow to a more, let's say, successful experience in the city of Samarra. On the other hand, we also have the presence of Asaib Ahl al-Haq in northern Diyala and Badr in central Diyala, where they have been both on the one hand successful in recruiting Sunni residents within their ranks, but also like in establishing more lucrative power sharing mechanisms for the manning of checkpoints, which implies also a lot of like opportunities to self-cater or like self-enrich in parallel to receiving payroll from the PMU Commission. And the third type of units are rather more mobile units that can be found almost like in every province in a different time, because they're there like to boost the capabilities of other more disadvantaged formations such as Kataib Hezbollah, Kataib Imam Ali. Depending on their different functions, the different functions and roles they slip into, and also like depending on the authorization they get from the PMU Commission, they demonstrate different combat capabilities. So for example, like the first group that I would like to address are the Iran-backed groups. They have on the one hand like not only better equipment, but they also have like a higher form of authorization to spearhead offensive operations. Now, like their success on the one hand can be attributed to the experience which they have accumulated in participating or like leading major operations, and on the other hand, like in their much better or like unprecedented access to heavy artillery, battle tanks, and also like vital intelligence support. So units like from those ranks are Kataib Sayyid al-Shuhada, led by Abu al-Aloosy, Asaib Ahl al-Haq, Kataib Imam Ali, and as I mentioned, like Kataib Hezbollah. Also, like a lot of them have authorized some of their volunteers to fight on the side of regime forces in Syria, which on the one hand like has allowed them to still have claim on receiving the salaries from the PMU Commission, but on the other hand like has enabled them to accumulate additional military experience. Second type, like if we look at the other side of the continuum, we have the more militarily or organizationally, operationally disadvantaged units that I would say have a capability restricted largely to defense operations. Their equipment has also like been limited to light arms, to those like we can count Sunni tribal units, but also the units aligned like with the shrines. They also like replicate the same function which I spoke to, like being restricted to specific like local areas of operation. So they have like small arms and soft skin vehicles. In the middle like of these two extremes, we have sort of a third group. They have like some experience in swarming, which is a military tactic meant to overwhelm the defenses of a specific target. But in larger offensive operations, like they would count on like this more fluid or like mobile units, like to compensate like for their limited access, like to both like to intelligence support, but also like in terms of their equipment. They have some light artillery and also like small numbers of armed vehicles. The equipment of the PMU like is to a large extent very difficult to track down or like to pin down, because one of the first problems that we face with that is with the catchphrase Hezbollah, because in a lot of cases like this is being used synonymous for every militia unit that roams autonomously across the Iraqi territory. This ambivalence comes from the fact that some of those factions have on the one hand a brigade registered with the PMU Commission that nominally answers to the chairman of the PMU Commission, Falah al-Fayyad, or like more directly than the commander-in-chief. But on the other hand, like they have preserved a presence outside of the PMU Commission. So for example, like when their members get implicated in certain human rights violations or appear at a video footage as a sniper during the crackdown of protesters, we can hardly know if this has really been the case of a person who actually possesses an official like badge from the PMU Commission. And I think like that's an organizational problem or like deficit that a lot of, let's say, the institution builders or the architects of this paramilitary structure are going to try to address in future. Among Iran-sponsored equipment, we read in reports about anti-tank guided missiles, also SPG rifles, but also like we have an interesting phenomenon of some of the brigades establishing their own parallel military industries. And one of the interesting ventures or enterprises here is from Kataib Hezbollah in Ain al-Tamur, near the Razaza Lake, which has been reported in being engaged in rocket artillery production and storage facilities. So the last point that I would like to clarify refers to a very controversial statement in September for the creation of a Hashd Air Force. To my knowledge, there is still no blueprint for the creation of a Hashd Air Force, but like most of my sources have referred to the document of being fake, even though initially it had the signature of Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes. But what I do see as realistic, especially with increasing airstrikes, be it from US or like from Israel on strategic weapon depots or like locations along the Syrian border, is that they may try like to develop or like to boost their drone warfare, and this would most logically like happen under the Aviation Directorate, and the Aviation Directorate under the Executive Order 313 is supposed to be embedded within the reconnaissance brigades of the Intelligence Directorate. So like if we look at that like and remember like who would be the new chief of staff of the popular mobilization units, we would still see like a heavy footprint by those pre-existing factions such as Qatab, Hezbollah. Last but not least, I would like to remind you that the strategic question remains how they have managed in attaining this level of prominence and institutional leverage. And looking at this rather limited combat capabilities, I would say that the answer is to be found somewhere else. And this is very much in their expediency to be deployed as an ideologically grounded and reliable Praetorian-like guardian of a Shia-censored state model that has far too willingly deployed such units as an insurance policy to safeguard their grip on power, often at the expense of the structures of the formal state and of the notion of statehood in Iraq. But this also has turned to a liability from the perspective of the Hashd, because being associated now, having a formalized affiliation with the dysfunctional state security apparatus that currently suffers from a legitimacy crisis, very much rubs against their popular or symbolic power. And so far it has been the street legitimacy, or terms like Hashd Muqaddas, or the Holy Hashd, that has to an extent helped them compensate for these limited combat capabilities. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Shukran jazilan. So far as the Air Force capabilities in 2017, there was talk of that support from the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Air Force wing was some thinking that the popular mobilization should be dividing them to land warfare units, air force, sea, naval force. The document in the end did not succeed for fear of attracting US attention. The second idea was the popular mobilization can be more effective if they focused on the drone capabilities, similarly to what the Houthis are doing in Yemen. For this reason, they focus their attention on acquiring the drone technologies and set aside for the time being the division into specialized arms or units. Both the Hezbollah and the popular mobilization managed to utilize the capabilities of the state. In the case of the Hezbollah, they utilize the political capabilities of the Lebanese state. In the Iraqi case, they used the political, economic, and the sectarian aspect. They benefited from the state's budget and also integrating the popular mobilization forces with the regular Iraqi armed forces. And of course, Hezbollah doesn't think like that. The Houthis think like that. Thank you very much. The third panelist is Dr. Abdou Moussa. He is from Egypt. He has an MA degree in political science. He is a researcher here with us in the center, and he pays special attention to the social aspects of war against terrorism, and he has some writings about Sinai, and he will be talking to us about the hybrid warfare strategies and tactics with application to tribal militias in the Sinai. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to thank our colleagues at the center for their kind invitation to deliver this paper. I just made slight changes in the title, and maybe I should start expressing some epistemological concern on any talk about hybrid warfare, because what I noticed, in fact, when I refer to the literature, that when in the case of Sinai, it's either of a concern raised over human rights violation, or a concerns because of the dangers emanating from any war on terror. So these are not the only problems when we remember that there is a huge lack in the information. Also, when it comes to covering events active in the field, there is always the possibility of not having clear-cut information, verified information, and also the way states behave, and particularly here the state in Egypt, vis-a-vis the tribal militias in the Sinai. The general framework is to understand the logistic and other support acts of support in the hybrid warfare, and also in the context of hybrid warfare, when there is reliance on the tribal militias to fight the inclusive capacity, which means to increase the fighting capabilities of the local community to share in the fighting with the regular state forces, and also taking into account the values in society, and to minimize the human cost when there is a situation of war going on. As for the exchange of roles through sharing the resources between the two parts, like the state forces and the armed militias who fight on the side of the government to face the challenges of the fighting itself and other consequences. I chose to talk about Sinai because I had my working experience beforehand, and also my concerns so far as human rights are concerned from 2014, and my focus was on communal development and to achieve stability. Dr. Ashur in the morning has saved me effort to talk about the tactical and operational. So he saved me. He saved me 5 minutes from the half an hour I was given. Of course, what we're talking about is the non-linear, asymmetrical warfare that we're talking about, when there is a low degree or middle degree of intensity in the conflict, and the field is where all this fighting takes part with all the other relative aspects. Before delving into details, I would like to present a way for analyzing the field or the theater of the fighting. Before we delve into more details, especially when we're talking about areas known to be of tribal nature or conservative nature. McDowell's approach speaks of state as an almost by Shell's definition is that the state is a legal framework and it behaves according to certain standards. But when looking at the reality, we'll find that this is not the case, that there are centers of power, institutionalized and not which control the outputs of the authority and the power struggles. And Bourdieu here says that the authority of this is space for struggle, and also to distinguish between four actors, even if they in some approaches unify the army with the state and unites the militia with the tribe. In the case of the Sinai, when we talk about the tribe and the state, but the state can mean army or the intelligence service or the elite, the capitalist elite. When we talk about the tribe, we talk about the armed component, or culturally speaking, the tribes occupying geographical spaces. So my suggestion is to refer back to the four-actor module here, and my paper will give you plenty of details on that. The approach combines the contextual side and the structural side. I will go directly into the structural side. I presented this in a previous study, 2016. To save time, we must understand the historical crisis faced by the state in Egypt, because there is a lot of studies, mostly of propaganda in nature, and most of the papers on fighting terrorism are based on Israeli and American perceptions, and they are very minimalist, and they lead to very weak conclusions. In a nutshell, there are the considerations of marginalization, poverty, lack of economic engagement and ownership, and also the changes tribes have gone through. I saw a lot of research still use old maps for the footprint of tribes in Sinai. The biggest problem with that is, if you, maybe I can give examples of such maps, did not understand the changes tribes have gone through from an economic point of view. We do not have any more tribes which are living on raising cattle and grazing cattle. They're mostly urbanized now. With the type of urbanization that took place in Sinai, the areas which had no value in the struggle between tribes have gained more importance, like coastal areas now, because of tourists' attention in them. Also, in the studies belonging to the early 20th century are no longer enough to understand. For example, also the system of tribal chieftains, now they are more like the position of a mayor in a small town or city rather than a tribal chief as seen in the Gulf areas, for example. Also land ownership, also and the nature of relations of the tribes with the state, and most of the incentives for government and what the government does in Sinai is not related to the rebellion in Sinai, insurgency in Sinai. And Omar has some stories he can tell you about that when it comes to understand what's the concept of Bedouin life and how this has been a perpetual concept from the days of Muhammad Ali. The inhabitants of Sinai have been rebellious against the state, and also despite the military coup and what happened, the situation has in essence been the same. There is a foreign or outside linkage which links what happens in Sinai with Raqqa and Moussa and other places in Iraq and others. I think here we are forcing some concepts which are unrealistic and oversimplistic, to say the least, like the tribal mobilization, etc., in Iraq compared to the tribal militias. As for the outside financing and arming, the main source for that comes from Libya to the Sinai people. So there's a geographical challenge. This area is flat. There is two little hills maybe, but the rest is just featureless flat terrain. As for the war against ISIS in Iraq, which led to international coalitions, I think the concepts derived from that war has been imposed on the situation in Sinai, and of course added to that is human trafficking, drug smuggling, weapons smuggling, etc. If we understand, if we want to analyze the components of the colon and Rajfar theory, that the war, hybrid war means exploiting the vulnerabilities of the enemy when the state faces organizations, or the organizations, when they face the government, they try to target the areas where the relationship between the state and the communities are concerned. Also, the states, on their part, try to demolish the reputation of these armed groups and destroy their resources and logistic capabilities to impact public opinion using religious and other slogans. Of course, this is in addition to the direct military and security capabilities. Both sides build their strategies on two aims. First of all, to penetrate the community and public opinion, and also to create a synergic effect resulting from a wide range of tactics. You cannot understand that this kind of tactics belongs to the hybrid warfare or not if you take each tactic at a time. For this reason, if we want to understand them through the concurrent usage of more than one tactic to create the kind of effect in the field, may be a good entry point to understand that. For the state's incentives, I have to be quick. There's many details here, but it seems that the state And here I'm dealing with at least from 2013 to 2019, although the paper itself is more focused on the establishment of these groups in 2017. So maybe some analysts agree on this, and they think that the government's inability to understand the nature of the conflict, the lack of transparency about the operations, and the high human cost of these operations. After the Al-Horr mosques incident, the state changed its old conviction. There was always been that the government should monopolize the use of arms and violence. The government changed their old perception that nobody should be allowed to carry arms behind its back or without its authority, even if it's a proxy to the government. I followed the discourse by the state and also the directives and decrees taken. The government tried to run forward by blame everything on the leaders of the militias, that they belong to certain well-known tribes in Sinai, and this is a well-known inherited concept for this government in Egypt. So they started talking about the necessity to absorb and integrate and include these militias and give them some sort of an independence. This is, of course, there is a previous experience in arming the tribes in the upper delta in Egypt. Also, they recalled some previous examples, and most of the experts focused on the importance of intelligence gathering and the ability to counter the sabotage by these militias. In the past, there was reliance on informants and some scouts who used to accompany the government forces to track these fighters, but without actually taking part in the fighting. And the focus on tribal rebellion has been reduced somewhat, and this was according to the old conviction by the state that the tribe now has more resources, and if the state wants to arm the tribes, some actually put it so simply as saying that similarly to arming them, we can disarm them. I think this is a ridiculous notion which is not applicable in reality. I think the book on ISIS explains how they perform in local communities. Also, the government tries to substitute the violence exerted by it by violence exerted by the tribes. This is an important aspect also, and the government has always maintained that there is wide-ranging solidarity amongst the tribes with the state. In fact, what I have managed to monitor until now, and I got details in this, the state has agreed with tribes individually or with factions within each tribe. And this is an important aspect when we come to the differences between tribes. So this approach until now has not led to one overwhelming umbrella for all tribes. And also ISIS tried to take into account the sectarian aspect and also to promote certain leadership figures, and the state has been doing that, but to evaluate it until now, no single tribe amongst the 25 tribes living in Sinai to say that has been loyal to ISIS, for example. And also trying to reignite all the differences. This has been tried by ISIS, and the government does the same. The difference between the state does the same, but with the state there is some sort of norm, and the tribe vis-a-vis this approach by the government have developed approaches to accept that although the tribe, when faced by ISIS trying the same, is not sure how to respond. Also, there are attempts to put an end to the large movement of tribes and transfers as a result of the fighting. So who is the enemy that we're talking about? Omar and others talked about this in previous studies, but when we talk about Islamist jihadist militias or fighting forces, when you look at their ideological or when even their doctrine, their fighting doctrine and what they prefer to do, and Omar maybe has mentioned some of these differences, that some organizations are formed of former military personnel, and some are have more experience in insurgency fighting. Some just are there for revenge against the state. Also, when it comes to the ability to continue fighting, if you see the group of slogans on the right, this is a border transcending organization between Egypt and Palestine, and they pledged their allegiance to al-Baghdadi, and this called as the Sinai Wilaya. These are until probably 1916. There are some smaller organizations like Al-Murabitun and Hisham al-Ashmawi, who was arrested in Libya, who pledged allegiance to ISIS, but then he joined another group. Also, there is in between these two groups, there is a third group which is called Ajnad Masr. These organizations vary in their fighting capabilities, their efficiency. This is another 2016 slide. I just want to draw attention to the question of these maps, this is the map of Sinai. This is the area where ISIS is active. When people say the area is as big as the area of Palestine, I just gave them a little bit extra. رفح الشيخ زويد العريش. But we must also, the area C is the demilitarized area, and also the area E, which has 4,000 Israeli troops on the other side. But areas A and B, according to the peace agreements, there should be 22,000 troops from Bir al-Ab, Al-Hasna, Nikhil until north of Sharm el-Sheikh. This is area B, and area A. There should have no more than 22,000 soldiers and 7 artillery batteries, 1 armored brigade, and 1. So it's limited in the military capabilities allowed. Area B has 3,000 border patrols, and the area C have only police with personal sidearms. According to the Chief of Staff of the Egyptian forces, there's been a change in the deployment from the days of Mubarak, but what happened in 2017, after agreements by Israel on more than one occasion, there was 41 brigades, and also area C became a totally militarized zone with army units deployed, with ultimately 42,000 troops were deployed there, according to the Chief of Staff of the Egyptian Armed Forces. I analyzed this in my paper, and I doubt whether these 42,000 people, soldiers, are active combatant soldiers or border patrol. I want to end by saying that the social engineering that happened in this area and the evacuation of more than 4,000 families and were placed in the Rafah and Og areas, and also the decrees to impose states of emergency and curfews, etc. They determine these areas and the map of the area. Human Rights Watch has used this analysis, and they spoke of controlling the movements and the transfer and the social engineering and banning certain economic activities, and also determine the times of the tribal relations. Finally, in 5 minutes, the tribal militias are small in number. They cannot be compared to the other groups our colleagues have talked about, but like the Marta Salim brigades or the death squads or Sinai awakening or etc. The Tarabin brigade, brigade 103, 121. Ibrahim Al-Argan is the main face. He's sitting here with Sisi. He is a small businessman who was in state of rebellion against the state. He was arrested, he was in prison, and all the wealth he generated, he had a business which was not active. He was like he belongs to the Argania tribe, and he was working with tourists as tourist guide or something. Only a few months ago there was some news that Ibrahim al-Argani is now running a huge company in Sinai, and he's trying to have a capital of $100 million or $90 million, and to raise this capital, and Ibrahim al-Argani has moved from someone who is an enemy of the state to a strategic partner of the state, and it's estimated that he has some 250 fighters, some say 1,000. They move with a degree of autonomy according to the tribal interest, or I try to distribute this paper. There are 7 spaces where the regular forces exchange roles with non-state actors, and when it comes to the resources, there is a lot of details in this which relies on the database that we established. But before I conclude, I want to mention some perceptions to see how, or the model I'm proposing. I'm just proposing a model. This is the dividing line. The lighter colors are the share of each party in the exchange of roles. The state is very weak when it comes to its provision of services, and it relies on the tribe. So therefore, protecting schools and providing teachers in the Sheikh Zayed area is very important for the tribe, because the government withdrew from that. It's very critical. Also, intelligence planning. The tribes have begun to, they are very good when it comes to informing on others. They have inter-tribal agreements, and each tribe informs of people and they have rewards for those who repent, for those who provide intelligence, and also, so there is some clear degree of independence operationally. There was a time when a tribal force went out, executed a mission. They killed the civilians on the instructions on behalf of the state. So therefore, when it comes to the transfer, there is many details, and on the logistic side, sometimes the military units can be deprived of their supply, so the tribe can fill in the gap. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have 3 clear examples when it comes to the role of these militias or groups. So what really attracts our attention is that the exchanged capabilities between the different groups and the state as to how each one helps the other. We have approximately 25 minutes for the questions, and I would like to take 4 questions, and then I would like to come back to the different speakers, the panelists in the session. Thank you very much. I would like to thank
Ina. So Al-Khal Abu Fadak, I think they call him Al-Khal. Right. So he basically replaced Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. But there is another component on the Iranian side, which is Haji Qasim. So do you think the new replacement and they would go along together to replace the previous combo, Abu Mahdi and Haji Qasim, so the new director of the IRGC and Al-Khal Abu Fadak, do you think they will both together replace? Do you think they will fill the gap left by Haji Qasim? Thank you.
Thank you. تفضل. الميكروفون هنا.
Thank you very much. Brother Mus'ab Al-Aloosy, the strategy of Hezbollah today, is it based on the defense of south of Lebanon or working outside the borders of Lebanon? This is the question that I would like to pose. With regard to Sister Eva.
There is a problem with the translation.
Would like me to repeat the question? Can you wait, please? Can you hear me?
So, okay.
هل تسمعني؟ With regard to Eva, the formation of Al-Hashd al-Shabi, the popular mobilization, there was a Shiite fatwa. It was not an independent fatwa. So not all Iraqi citizens have been invited to the popular mobilization. You said that it was independent. You talked about them being independent. So issuing a popular mobilization law, the factions up to now have not worked in keeping with this law, and in actual fact it is in contradiction with the law. There are a number of statements by the commanders of the factions that are against the state, which is a policy that is that it cooperates with neighboring countries and so on. With regard to the presence of the popular mobilization since the end of ISIS till date is in charge of the security side, and this leads to so much sensitivities with the local people because the duties of the security apparatus is different from the popular mobilization duties. So this should be revisited and reviewed when it comes to their presence in those regions. Some factions of the popular mobilization, they work outside the borders, so they do not work as part of the armed forces. Mr. Farhad. So please make your interventions very short. In a session in Lebanon, we're talking about Sinai. With regard to Sinai and the situation of tribes and militias, we heard a viewpoint that says that the area between Port Said and the other area does not have any resorts. That is why the social, economic, and tribal situation is below the level of other areas. So why would Egypt not do so? Has there been a decision undertaken by the state not to develop these areas, although these areas are much better than Marsa Alam and Dhahab and so on and so forth? My question is to Mr. Abdou. Thank you very much for your paper. There are 2 sections. The first one about the state's incentives. I have a question. You said that this heritage to combat and confront what is happening in Sinai, and also to motivate those tribes in order to fight Daesh. So we do remember the fighters and resistance groups in Sinai, and remembering what used to happen in their resistance against Israel. So now the situation is different. Now we're talking about members of the tribes themselves who have been recruited by Daesh or ISIS. So what I have noticed, there is limiting the importance of these members, particularly when it comes to fighting the different armed groups, particularly when it comes to Wilayat Sinai and in the narrative of the state. So this is what we see in the different statements. The military spokesperson does not mention the armed forces, particularly 103 Brigade or the Death Squad and many of other militias in those areas. The second part is about the tribal motivation. Do you see a difference between what we call the support of the military of Egypt and the incentives and motivations? Are they more than the ones that have been given to those who have joined as part of their doctrine, as you have mentioned? So to what extent do you think the effectiveness is different? The last question that I would like to pose, where are these militias heading, particularly the tribal militias? We have seen that they are in decrease, on the decline after Al-Aloosy assassination. So I would like to say that there is a level of stability in terms of fighting. So we have the number of victims is on the decline. The same thing applies to the victims in terms of civilians, and also we have a process of displacement, forced displacement in those areas and the surrounding area of the airport and so on. Let's be brief. We're going to take 5 interventions. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. We'd like to thank the different speakers. I have a question that I would like to pose here. Most armies, they have a clear military doctrine in their own countries. So joining these non-state actors, do you think that the allegiance is going to be the state, as we see in the situation that we have in Iraq or in Lebanon or any other countries? Do you think the allegiance is going to be those countries, or the allegiance is going to be external?
Thank you very much. David Archiashvili from Georgia. My question goes to to Professor Al-Aloosy regarding the Hezbollah deterrence policy. According to certain interpretations, the very notion of hybrid warfare emerged from the developments regarding the confrontation between Israeli and Hezbollah. So my question is, what do you think about other non-military aspects of deterrence, especially informational interventions, which basically damaged Israel's image internationally? So how important it was from the Hezbollah side to employ other than military means in this deterrence?
Thank you. هناك لو سمحت. خلينا ناخذ بس من الجهة اليسار لو سمحتوا بس. هنا.
My question is to Mr. Abdou. You talked about funding from Libya. So you're talking about money and weapons. So isn't Libya on the western border? Perhaps geographically it is far away, and this might be a challenge and an impediment with the existence of the regime in those areas. My question is to Dr. Musab Al-Aloosy. I think that Hezbollah is no longer denominated as an armed non-governmental group. So if we'd like to describe Hezbollah, we can say in occupation, ideal occupation force. So their funding is external, their decisions are external, their allegiance are external. They control the government, they impede the election and nomination of the president. It fights outside the country. As Dr. Mahjoubi had said, Hezbollah controls the state, completely controls the state, and militarily and politically. So these are no longer armed groups. These are a state within a state. Thank you very much to you all. I would like to go back to the speakers. Would like to start with ladies. Ladies first. 2 minutes, please.
I would start with the first question regarding the fatwa. It's true like that the fatwa was released after the fall of Mosul by Ayatollah Sistani, but the wording of the fatwa, if you analyze it, it never called for the establishment of a parallel paramilitary force, if you read the official document. Like also the House often refrained from using the term Hashd al-Shabi, but referred to them as volunteers. And Ayatollah Sayyid Sistani had often reprimanded any abuse or like use of the name of the Hashd al-Shabi for political purposes. So for example, when the campaigning started before the parliamentary elections, there was also like a lot of criticism targeted of using the name Fatah for Tahaluf al-Fatah from Hadi al-Amri, because it already implied the conquest or like the battlefield legitimacy hard won by the Hashd, which implied like that this would be used like for political reasons. So like even though I said that the fatwa did bestow legitimacy and symbolic power, because a lot of them argue when I pose the question like where does the legitimacy stem from, there are like always three answers. First is the fatwa, like the religious, the moral legitimacy. Second is qanuni, like through the law and like through the legislative, let's say, practices, documents that have been released, several decrees, executive orders in addition to the law. And the third has been the street legitimacy, like the popular legitimacy. It's Hashd al-Shabi. On that, I would also like to quote another incident that happened after they searched the US embassy. There was an interesting statement on Twitter by the commander of Kataib Sayyid al-Shuhada, Abdul Aziz. He said it was not Hashd al-Sha'bi that stormed the embassy. It was Sha'b Hashdi. So like this was once again an attempt to build on like these three sources of legitimacy. Like if we go back to Max Weber, go away from monopoly on violence, which we don't have, I think with all of the presentations, we saw that we only have a negotiated or like a power shared like form of monopoly on violence. He tried like to draw on like this third source of legitimacy, which is more like the charismatic and like the traditional one. And I think like very much they are trying like to navigate on the one hand between being a state-sanctioned security agency and on the other hand, preserving the charisma or like the DNA of a popular army. And I think like this currently poses a lot of like dilemmas like for the leadership, especially like those that really want to build an institution and those who are not really convinced that being under the control of the state necessarily is going to strengthen the morale. And I just wanted like to connect to your presentation with Hezbollah. I think we have a similar problem because there is a diminishing trust in the foundations of statehood. So a lot of like those leaders, I would even like move away from this proxy debate or like from being remote controlled by Iran. A lot of them do believe that the only way to protect the Iraq that they want to see or like their vision for Iraq is by preserving one foot outside of the control of the state. And the argument is the following, that next time when the Islamic State stands in front of Baghdad and the Hashd has already become as corrupt or like as bureaucratic as the Iraqi army, who is going to protect the state? Now, this is not my opinion, but I was just like hearing the function of also conveying like the discourse that has been adopted there. And to come back on your question on Abu Fadak, I think like what we have seen here is more a different dynamic. There has been like more of talks and discussions of the role of the Lebanese Hezbollah and of Hassan Nasrallah of taking on the second role, like that has been so far like played by Qasem Soleimani. So like there have been like meetings with Qatharani. There was also like this highly advertised and also like to a lot of supporters of Sadr shocking meeting in Qom, where you had a reunion of the former Fasail al-Muqawama. You had the brother of Qais al-Hazali, Akram Ka'abi, Muqtada Sadr. But I think like this honeymoon is not necessarily sustainable, because even though they might unite right now over the common agenda of like expelling US forces from the country, that doesn't mean like that first, the very pragmatic, like non-ideological like conflict over turfs as spoils is going to be resolved. And second, like we have very different like nuances of ideological orientation. Even like within the so-called Iran-aligned camp that's often being generalized as pro-Wilad, Faqih, Khamenei loyalists, even there like there are different nuances, interpretations, and some of them feel very comfortable like with the parliamentary system that they have in Iraq, because it also allows them to push for the same agendas, to pursue their interests without having necessarily to establish a rule of the jurisprudence.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you.
السؤال الأول كان إنه هل استراتيجيات
So the question, are the strategies of Hezbollah war or defense, or to intervene in other regions? I do not see any contradiction between the two strategies. Hezbollah can defend Lebanon and can compete with Israel, and at the same time it can train militias and armed groups in Yemen and Iraq or even in Syria. So the fact that that Hezbollah has missiles M600 are not going to be used in Iraq, Yemen and Syria, but perhaps can be used against Israel. And at the same time, Israel can intervene in other conflicts as well. The second question with regard to allegiance. So Hezbollah is not part of the Lebanese army, so it is impossible for me to answer this question. I think it is close to popular mobilization in Iraq. The third question, please allow me to answer your question. هذا جانب ممتاز تحدث عنه، وهذه تعتبر قضية مهمة عندما يتعلق الأمر بالردع استخدامه حزب الله في تسعينيات القرن الماضي. قد تم استخدام وسائل الإعلام في كل العمليات العسكرية تم استخدامها ضد إسرائيل، وحزب الله خدمته هذه المسألة بشكل كبير جدا. هناك جانب آخر يتعلق بالمصداقية، وهو يتعلق بشكل خاص بمصداقية حسن نصر الله عندما يتحدث أمر باستهداف مصنع أمونيا مثلا أو مخزن قريب من حيفا. بالطبع أن هناك الكثير من الندر التي توجد في إسرائيل مثلا. إذن هناك إيمان بحزب الله خطاباتي. إذن المصداقية هي مهمة للغاية. The last question is that Hezbollah is not an armed group and it is an occupying group to Lebanon. The definition when it comes to non-armed armed groups is as having weapons outside the scope of the state, irrespective of the personal opinion of any researcher, whether Hezbollah follows 100% Iran or it is whether it is independent or there is alliance between the two groups. So these groups, they have weapons outside the scope and framework of the state, and this is the situation when it comes to Hezbollah. It follows Iran and it is a state within a state. We have to recognize whether you like Hezbollah or do not like Hezbollah, there are followers of Hezbollah within Lebanon, and I do not think it is only a state within a state. It is an occupying state. I went to Lebanon more than once, many times, and there are people who believe in the ideas of Hezbollah, and they believe that Hezbollah is defending their own interests, so we cannot deny that. Thank you very much. Thank you for the questions. with regard to the development of the region of the northern part of Bir al-Abd. This is one of the problems that we cannot understand due to the resources that exist in that particular region. But if we try to understand, we can see some plans to develop Sinai. So many of those plans have not been implemented. No more than 10% has been implemented when it comes to these plans since the Mubarak reign till date. So when we talk about the comprehensive plan to develop Sinai, the 5-year plan to develop Sinai, not even 10% has been implemented. And the scope of this implementation, I think it clarifies the conflict or distribution and the problem in which the authority is embroiled. On the other hand, one of the most important economic areas is Mahagir and Tadin. I gave you 2 examples. The example of Ibrahim al-Aghdani, who was against the state. He was, and after that, he had a number of mining projects, and he has in excess of 13,000 persons working for him. Is this an attempt to motivate the tribal in order to redistribute through the tribal and also to create allegiances through interest? Is this a wise policy or not? So how is this funding between the state and the militias? With regard to the Mujahideen of Sinai, so this is mainly rhetoric. So when we talk about the tribe, we have to deal with the tribe that this is not the party that understands less. It is not the traditional tribe that exists in Arab movies. No, we're talking about a very intricate structure. Ibrahim al-Arghani, he talks about a holding company in mining, and that has 13,000 employees. So it is a very modern structure. So this structure no longer believes in the discourse of the state. And these are people, they have their own tribes, and up to now, they have been dealt with and treated with awe. You're talking about the fact that those militias have come to an end. No, some members, certain persons, we have Ibrahim al-Arghani. So the change of leadership and elite has not changed the ideas. So this has broken the defensive and security conviction when it comes to securing the borders and how to control the social environment at the borders. It was not allowed, particularly when it comes to border security, to use weapons with the blessing of the state. So this is something very different. They always had weapons, they always used weapons, but to have the blessing of a state, this is different altogether. So what we have seen in 2015, the tribes asked for the formation in 2015. So within 1 week, the tribe apologized and denied the statement to accept such a thing from the assistant to the Minister of Interior and the intelligence services, and the media kept on tackling and discussing this matter. And in 2017, the situation was the opposite altogether. So the question about smuggling from Libya as a source of funding, that is why I said this might sound strange. Why wouldn't they take from Jordan? Because of the geographical distance between Libya and the Sinai area. Perhaps Jordan and Palestine are much closer. Why? So I would like to tell you that there are 3 things that have been monitored when it comes to the relationship between Sinai and Libya. So they have smuggled weapons, and also they have smuggled stolen cars. And this is what I meant with by funding, and it is through the tunnels to Gaza. And also the organization, it controls some of those tunnels, and they get also income as a result of that. And also we have the fighters that come from Libya. We have the Ashmawi story coming from the western part of Egypt, going to Sinai and so on and so forth. And they were also in Syria, so we have to know that. So this matter might sound not convincing, but this is the reality on the ground. This is what we have monitored on the ground. I would like to thank you so much. I would like to thank the different panelists, and we're going to continue with the discussion. Afterwards, I would like to thank Dr. Al-Aloosy. I would like to thank all the speakers with us, Mr. Musab Al-Aloosy, Mr. Abdou, Moussa. We're going to meet once again tomorrow. We're going to talk about the